There was a time when ESPN could show a routine fly ball in Cincinnati, throw jazz music under it, let Stuart Scott narrate it like a bank robbery, and somehow make it feel important. That was the magic trick. ESPN didn't just broadcast sports. It convinced America that sports were the center of culture itself. And for a while it worked. SportsCenter in the 90s felt less like television and more like a national ritual. Anchors became celebrities. Commercials became folklore. Chris Berman made noises that sounded like a printer having a stroke, and people treated it like Shakespeare. ESPN turned highlights into mythology. Then the internet arrived. Debate television arrived. Corporate panic arrived. And somewhere along the way, ESPN transformed from the worldwide leader in sports into a 24-hour anxiety disorder where 6 people scream about the Lakers while gambling odds crawl underneath the screen.
Come on, man.
Like a cocaine-designed stock ticker. The weird part is that ESPN is still successful. The ratings exist. The money definitely exists. But culturally, the network feels different now. Less like a sports clubhouse, more like content extraction. Even ESPN seems nostalgic for itself. That's why they keep reviving old This Is SportsCenter ads like a divorced dad showing you vacation photos before explaining NFTs. Because everybody remembers what ESPN used to feel like. So how did the coolest brand in sports become the human equivalent of a push notification? And more importantly, who the F thought Pat McAfee was the solution? ESPN began in 1978 with an idea that sounded insane at the time.
Eric Heiden won 5 individual gold medals.
A television channel showing sports all day, every day. No sitcoms, no movies, just sports, constantly. In the late 70s, this sounded like a business plan invented by a man banned from 3 casinos. Bill Rasmussen and his son Scott launched ESPN in 1979, and somehow the timing was perfect. Cable TV was exploding, leagues wanted exposure, and advertisers realized sports fans would happily watch 12 beer commercials if somebody showed them a backup quarterback scoring in Cleveland. But ESPN's real breakthrough wasn't live games, it was SportsCenter. Before social media, ESPN controlled the memory of sports. If you missed a game, you waited for SportsCenter. Entire sports memories were built from 6-second highlights edited to rock music.
He wanted to own the photographs so that he wouldn't be exploited as time went on.
Then came the personalities. Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann made sports feel intelligent. Stuart Scott brought swagger to a format that previously sounded like a substitute teacher reading weather reports. Chris Berman became famous for making noises that legally should not count as language. And somehow, it worked. By the 90s, ESPN wasn't just a channel anymore. It was sports culture. ESPN2, ESPN Radio, X Games, ESPN.com, the This Is SportsCenter commercials. The network built an entire universe around sports fans. And most importantly, ESPN still felt human. Even after Disney got involved, the network still felt playful, weird, and genuinely made by people who loved sports. By 2011, ESPN reached over 100 million households. It had effectively become the default setting for sports in America. Then somebody inside the company discovered a horrifying truth.
The cafeteria grabbed bread. That's all he did, just grab a bunch of bread and start shoving it in his mouth.
Arguments got better ratings than highlights, and once outrage becomes more profitable than joy, the entire culture changes. The first real warning sign arrived in 2010 wearing a tailored suit and an hour-long ESPN special called The Decision. LeBron James sat on live television and announced where he would play basketball next season while the sports media industry pretended this was normal. Today that feels routine because sports coverage has fully merged with celebrity culture. But at the time it felt surreal. Less journalism, more hostage negotiations sponsored by Sprite. And ESPN knew exactly what it was doing. Even ESPN's own ombudsman later called the special a glorified infomercial. The network stopped covering the circus and realized it could own the tent instead. But the decision wasn't the collapse, it was the business model presentation. Around the same time, ESPN discovered something deeply unhealthy about America.
But having my brother there dealing with it helped. And he also has a good attitude for that.
Viewers reacted more emotionally to arguments than actual sports. That changed everything. In 2007, ESPN turned a struggling morning show called Cold Pizza into First Take. By 2011, the network fully committed to debate television with Skip Bayless and Stephen A. Smith yelling across a desk like two men settling a divorce through sports metaphors. And the ratings exploded. ESPN had discovered the emotional equivalent of junk food. Highlights were expensive, journalism took effort, but putting two loud personalities in a room to argue whether LeBron was clutch, that printed money. And once outrage becomes more profitable than joy, the games themselves quietly stop mattering. In 2016, First Take replaced hours of SportsCenter on ESPN's main channel. The show built on highlights was replaced by a show built on arguments about highlights. SportsCenter existed to show you what happened. Modern ESPN increasingly existed to tell you how Stephen A. Smith felt about what happened. Even ESPN executives later admitted they'd gone too far. One executive confessed the network had de-emphasized video and storytelling, which is an incredible sentence for a television company. That's like Netflix admitting it got distracted from movies. Then came the layoffs. In 2015, ESPN cut roughly 300 jobs. In 2017, another wave hit on-air talent. Then in 2020, around 500 more positions disappeared globally. Familiar faces vanished while debate shows somehow got louder. To longtime viewers, it felt like ESPN was removing the people who made the network human and replacing them with content. Nothing symbolized that shift more than the death of Grantland. Bill Simmons' long-form sports and culture site wasn't engagement. People genuinely loved it. It published smart, weird writing, the kind people sent each other at 1:14 a.m. with, "You need to read this immediately." Then ESPN killed it in 2015, and fans instantly understood what that meant. ESPN wasn't cutting dead weight, it was killing the smartest part of itself. At the same time, the internet was destroying the old SportsCenter model anyway. Before Twitter and YouTube, ESPN controlled highlights. By the mid-2000s, everybody had clips instantly.
Listen, I'm sorry, man. Listen, okay? I'm sure.
Reddit posted highlights before games even ended. ESPN no longer controlled access to sports moments, so it doubled down on the one thing social media couldn't fully replace yet: personalities, which is how Stephen A. Smith evolved from commentator into human reaction GIF. And to be fair, Stephen A. is phenomenal television. The man can turn a routine NBA discussion into a Supreme Court closing argument.
I always say that I'm a very driven person to the point of almost being selfish.
Every sentence sounds engineered in a lab to go viral. By 2025, ESPN reportedly locked him into a contract worth at least $100 million over 5 years. Somewhere in America, there's probably a trauma surgeon earning less than a man screaming about the Knicks. And the stranger ESPN became, the more often it embarrassed itself. In 2017, ESPN removed commentator Robert Lee from calling a Virginia football game because executives worried social media might react badly to his name after Charlottesville. Robert Lee, the broadcaster, not the Confederate general. The internet detonated over the story because it perfectly captured modern ESPN, a network so terrified of online outrage that it kept manufacturing new outrage instead.
Before the back-to-back MVP awards, before he hit 402 three-pointers in the regular season.
Then came the Jemele Hill controversy. After Hill called Donald Trump a white supremacist on Twitter, ESPN distanced itself, suspended her, and immediately got dragged into America's culture war. Conservatives claimed ESPN was too political. Progressives claimed ESPN abandoned its own talent. ESPN somehow lost credibility with everybody simultaneously. Meanwhile, cable television itself was collapsing. At one point, ESPN reached over 100 million households. Then cord cutting took a chainsaw to cable. By 2024, subscriber numbers had dropped massively, and you could feel ESPN reacting in real time. More debate shows, more gambling integration, more content engineered for people barely watching television anymore.
Friday or Saturday night games, that was like the biggest deal for us because we knew we were going to the game that night.
Then ESPN entered its gambling era. In 2023, the network launched ESPN Bet through a partnership with Penn Entertainment, because apparently somebody at Disney decided sports coverage should feel more like a casino at 2:30 in the morning. Suddenly, odds graphics were everywhere. Pre-game coverage sounded like financial advice from a man with 3 monitors and a gambling addiction. The same network covering sports was now financially tied to gambling on those sports. Was this journalism? Entertainment? A sportsbook wearing a lanyard that says media? Even the partnership itself became messy. ESPN's Penn deal collapsed early, then DraftKings replaced them as the exclusive sportsbook partner. But honestly, nothing captures modern ESPN better than Pat McAfee. Because Pat McAfee doesn't feel like a broadcaster. He feels like somebody gave a podcast a caffeine addiction and healthcare benefits. ESPN brought McAfee in because executives desperately wanted younger audiences and internet energy, which usually ends with somebody apologizing through Notes app screenshots. Then came the Aaron Rodgers disaster. Rodgers went on McAfee's show and dragged Jimmy Kimmel into conspiracy nonsense connected to Jeffrey Epstein. ESPN publicly called the comments inaccurate. McAfee responded by accusing ESPN executives of sabotage on air. At that point, the network no longer felt like a sports broadcaster. It felt like HR trying to contain a podcast. McAfee later apologized for comments involving Caitlin Clark and for amplifying a false rumor about a college student, which perfectly captures modern ESPN. Old ESPN worried about journalism scandals. Modern ESPN keeps stumbling into influencer scandals. And through all of this, the internet roasted the network relentlessly. Older fans missed highlights. They missed creativity. They missed when ESPN felt like a sports network instead of a non-stop conveyor belt of takes. Because eventually, ESPN stopped acting like sports were fun. Everything became discourse. Every game became raw material for tomorrow morning's arguments. SportsCenter once made highlights feel cinematic. Modern ESPN treats them like evidence in a courtroom debate sponsored by FanDuel. And maybe the perfect image of the decline came during the NBA Finals in 2025 when a clip went viral appearing to show Stephen A. Smith playing solitaire on his phone courtside during the actual finals game. The face of modern sports debate culture literally looked bored by the basketball game happening in front of him.
The Golden State Warriors' record-breaking season is on the line.
The network that once made America obsessed with highlights now treats the games themselves like background footage for arguments. The arguments became the product, and the machine still hasn't stopped. The uncomfortable truth about ESPN is that the network didn't lose its soul because executives were incompetent. It lost its soul because most of the decisions actually made sense. ESPN was built for a world where sports highlights were scarce. In the 90s, if you missed a game, ESPN controlled the memory of it. Then the internet detonated that business model. Twitter had clips instantly. YouTube had compilations before midnight. Reddit uploaded highlights before broadcasters could cut to commercial. Showing people what happened stopped being valuable. So instead of reinventing the highlight, ESPN reinvented the argument. Old ESPN used personality to make sports more entertaining. Modern ESPN uses sports to make personalities more profitable.
Curry met by the switching Adams. Fires. Yes!
Which is why every show slowly mutates into the same format. Loud Desk, viral clips, NFL panic in April, NBA legacy debates in February, gambling odds crawling underneath the screen like the stock market during a nervous breakdown. And economically, ESPN almost had no choice. At its peak in 2011, the network reached over 100 million households. Then cable television collapsed while live sports rights became even more expensive. ESPN still needs the NFL and NBA because live games are basically the last thing keeping cable on life support. But debate television is cheap. You don't need investigative journalism. You just need a microphone and two people willing to argue about Dak Prescott until everybody involved wants to die. Which is why modern ESPN feels less like television and more like content designed to escape television. 30-second outrage clips, Stephen A. reaction GIFs, segments engineered for TikTok feeds and group chat arguments. And to be fair, it works.
Then Steph Curry does this.
First Take keeps growing. Sports rights still print money. But culturally, ESPN feels smaller now. Older ESPN felt expansive, weird sports, smart writing, human moments. Modern ESPN often feels like the same three arguments wearing different outfits. And the younger audience, ESPN desperately wants barely watches sports the same way anyway. They follow creators, clips, podcasts, streamers, gambling apps, and social feeds, which is exactly why ESPN now behaves more like the internet. But that creates a brutal irony. The more ESPN behaves like the internet, the less it feels like ESPN, which is why the network constantly falls back on nostalgia. Stuart Scott tributes.
His passion.
When I was in 8th grade, I made a decision to spend all year round on it.
Throwback SportsCenter clips, revived This is SportsCenter commercials, because even ESPN remembers what ESPN used to feel like. The strange thing about ESPN is that the network never actually died. Financially, it survived. The ratings still exist. Disney still treats ESPN like the last functioning life form inside cable television. But culturally, something absolutely died. Old ESPN made sports feel bigger than life. SportsCenter felt like a nightly gathering place for the sports world. The anchors sounded like fans. The highlights felt cinematic. Even the commercials had personality. Modern ESPN feels different. More screaming, more gambling graphics, less joy. And the weirdest part is that this transformation probably saved the company. ESPN didn't collapse because the people running it were stupid. They understood exactly where media was heading. The problem is that following those incentives slowly transformed the network into something weirdly joyless.
In 16 seasons, earning a reputation as one of the best shooters in the NBA.
Old ESPN made sports feel important. Modern ESPN often makes them feel like content inventory. And that's why older fans sound almost emotional talking about the network. They aren't just nostalgic for old highlights. They're nostalgic for a version of the internet where sports still felt communal instead of endlessly processed into clips, takes, reaction memes, and gambling promos. ESPN may never get that feeling back. Not because the company is collapsing, but because the world that created old ESPN no longer exists. The network still owns the rights to sports. It just lost the feeling of sports. And maybe that was inevitable the moment television executives realized arguing about games was more profitable than loving them. Like, subscribe and tell us which dying media empire we should autopsy next.